Welcome back to the Health Tech Hub by MyCare, the podcast where we are joined each and every month by a special guest to dive into the hottest topics in the world of healthcare and health tech. I'm your host as always, Paul Buckland. I'm the growth strategist at MyCare, and this month I'm joined by Lawrie Kidd, a consultant anaesthetist at Gloucestershire and Cheltenham Hospital, as well as a clinical transformation manager at DrDoctor. Thanks, Lawrie, for joining us on the podcast today. If you'd just like to give a quick introduction of what you do at DrDoctor for everybody listening, that'd be fantastic.
Thanks, Paul. So I do a couple of things. I kind of wear a few hats. So one of my hats is that as a consultant anaesthetist. So I work up in Gloucestershire at Gloucestershire and Cheltenham hospitals. And so I've been up there for a few years now as a NHS consultant, which is great. The other kind of hat I wear is with DrDoctor. So I work with a transformation team, and that's a great job actually, because I'm involved in some of the product stuff, some of the kind of product direction, but also I work a lot with kind of trusts and clinicians, trying to make sure that the stuff we do at DrDoctor remains clinically relevant and remains clinically safe and robust. So it's quite varied really. It's good.
Yeah, it sounds nice and varied. So what's kind of the background? What's your journey been so far kind of in healthcare, and how did you end up where you are now?
Like fed up with the system. And so that made me start thinking about what other avenues could be explored alongside my clinical work. So, in my heart, I'm a clinician. I love what I do. I love dealing with patients, and I'm incredibly lucky to do that. But I couldn't see the current way of working as a sustainable thing. So I started looking elsewhere, and then I kind of reached out to DrDoctor, and they took me on, and that's been a kind of really just a really cool journey. I suppose what kind of occurred to me the other day was we had a team day, and we were working. It was work, but we were also having loads of fun. Mm-hmm. And I was in an office with a coffee machine that was really nice and made you good coffee, and a fridge with food in it, and working with people who were motivated and people who were energized. And I just was looking around, I kind of pinched myself and thought wow, what would my hospital colleagues say? And even though DrDoctor and there's other companies like that who are innovating in the healthcare space, such as yourselves, but it's all being part of the solution. And they're all operating within the same ecosystem, but actually it's kind of poles apart in terms of what the kind of day-to-day process is like and what it's like. And that really got me thinking quite hard about the fact that I was heading towards a kind of unsustainable way of working in my sole clinical work. And then that kind of brought me to think about some of the kind of the harder aspects. And I think it's really important that people in health tech don't shy away from realizing how tough it is sometimes on the like saying on the cold face sounds a bit kind of serious and kind of a bit kind of, I don't know, a bit extreme, but it is very different. And so you asked me how I got here in terms of my training. I spent 6 years at med school, then a couple of years as a house officer, during which time I did a couple of exams. Then I went away and worked abroad for a bit, and then I had 3 years as a junior trainee anaesthetist, and during that time I did 4 exams. And meanwhile my wife was also doing exams as well, so that was quite hard. And then I did 5 years as a senior trainee anaesthetist, during which time I did 2 more exams. We had 2 babies. My wife was also doing the same, so she had, the challenges of being pregnant and juggling her family commitments and stuff. Age 38, I was still a junior doctor, which was a great feeling. And then eventually I kind of got to be a consultant. And the impact of training and being a junior doctor is hard. So you're doing night shifts, which are brutal. You're working weekends, so you can't have social life. You're working rotas, so there's no stability, so you can't actually kind of commit to things like sports clubs or teams or anything like that. You're commuting, and so every year there's junior doctors who fall asleep at the wheel. There was an awful case I think it was last year, where a junior doctor actually crashed into some people, crashed into a family at a zebra crossing when he fell asleep at the wheel. It was like absolutely horrendous. And there was a stat, I think it was about 57%, I think, of trainees, trainee anaesthetists said that they had been involved or nearly been involved in a crash while coming home after a night shift.
Yeah, I think that's something that, as you've mentioned, it's something that kind of goes under the radar, is because obviously the whole point of this episode is like the compassion in the NHS, because the NHS is a fantastic thing. We are super lucky to have it. And a lot of people spend a lot of time bashing the NHS for being, the wait times and things. And, I mean, everyone's had experiences where they've had long wait times, and it will continue to happen because they're so overworked and understaffed. And it's quite interesting because it's always about the experience that the patient gets. But it's interesting to kind of flip it around a little bit to be, well, how are the doctors, how are the nurses, how are the, how are they doing? Because if they're not, doing well, either physically, mentally, or from burnout, from, maybe some of the things they'll see while actually at the job, because like I said, I've never worked in a hospital, as you've kind of mentioned, but you'll see things that under most circumstances people won't see, right? So there's obviously the mental toll, and I think it's an interesting kind of way to kind of flip it on its head a little bit, because it definitely needs bringing to light, and people need to understand that humans are, the NHS is an organism, right? It's filled with, all of these people that want to do a good thing, and they just get hounded with, things. Oh, the wait time's too long, and to be honest, as we all know, it's outside of their control. It's, if somebody tells you off for, a wait time, it's not your fault that the wait time is as long as it is. It's just a kind of you're kind of having to deal with, you're like at the end of the line having to deal with it, like on the ground. So I think it is really interesting. And what is the perspective kind of like from within, I guess? Like, so how do you experience and navigate the challenges, and with that, how do you with all of the things you have to go through, how do you actually maintain a compassionate approach despite all of the other struggles that may be going on, within work? And how have you done it, and how do people do it?
Wow, there's a lot of stuff to unpick there. So I think so you said about about the kind of challenges of the kind of doctors and nurses, and the kind of clinical facing. There was some work which DrDoctor commissioned at the end of last year, I think, might be wrong, and that said that 75% of non-clinical but patient-facing staff, so you're talking admin staff, booking clerks, receptionists, had experienced some kind of abuse.
Wow.
And so
that's a scary statistic,
which is horrible. 69% of them thought it was due to the waiting lists. So you've got like kind of 7 pushing 8 million patients on waiting lists. But of those team, 43% said that they were pushed to tears on a weekly basis from the abuse.
Okay.
And despite that, I think 86% said that they still had empathy for the patients, which is just amazing, actually.
Really is.
And I think that empathy and that compassion is there. I think most people don't go into healthcare because it's particularly sexy or glamorous. Like, it's not a sexy or glamorous career.
It's hard work.
People go into it for all kinds of reasons, but mostly there is a kind of common thread of care and compassion in there somewhere. I think it's very easy for that to get diluted, and I think you see people as they become disillusioned and jaded, they can lack that kind of compassion and empathy. And I think about my job and the people who I've seen role modeling the kind of great behaviors. And actually, there's the kind of the technical and the non-technical skills. The technical skills is what you do in your training. Is how you, like in my job as an anaesthetist, is how you like put someone to sleep for an operation. You look after them to your best ability, and you deliver them afterwards, in great shape, comfortable, saying thank you to the theatre team for the care that they've had. The non-technical stuff is, for me, the really important stuff, and that's where you kind of really add value. And that's holding a patient's hand and telling them that you realise that they're scared and that it's not very nice. I think it's really hard to kind of to highlight the importance of that, but I think that really is important. And I'm really lucky in that I work with a ton of really kind, decent people who are, with a handful of exceptions, absolutely putting the patient at the forefront of what they do. But when people aren't putting the patient at the forefront of what they do, it's usually a sign that actually they've got too much on their plate. They've got too much going on.
I had an experience actually. I had a consultation. Was it last week? Maybe middle of last week. And the entire process, it was, there was some moments where I was thinking, I was a bit, like concerned, right? And everybody was fantastic. We were all making jokes, and it made such a profound impact on me, and it completely calmed me down. And there was nothing to worry about anyway. But as people know, a lot of people, when you say, oh, I'm going to the hospital, they think, oh, and it's like, going to the hospital doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. It's just, you might be going for various reasons, right? But I think there's a stigma where, oh, you're going to hospital. Oh, it's like negative, connotations come straight away with it, right? And not so much for me, but I know, like my partner, for instance, she can get worked up around it. So that if she goes into the waiting room, she might already be almost like a little bit of a mess. And and I think showing the compassion from the people that you're dealing with, it makes such a difference. It calms them down. And like I said, I had a really, really the staff, I couldn't have, the staff couldn't have been better. And interesting enough as well, I saw something on YouTube, out of all places, but it was in America, and unfortunately some police officer had been shot, but some bystander basically stood next to him and as you said, held his hand and was just talking to him and just telling him everything, while the hospital arrived. And in an interview afterwards, that he said that was the thing that kept him, kind of in one place, that kept him sane, and gave him hope. Just as simple as holding his hand and just talking to him and saying, it's going to be okay. I know it hurts, right? But we'll get through it. And I think, as you said, that kind of goes amiss when the human side of care is obviously the most compelling side. So yeah, I think it is interesting. I think the statistics you pulled up, especially around, the 46 or 48% or whatever it may have been, are reduced to tears on a weekly basis. I don't think you can think of many jobs in the world that has a statistic close to that, where people are being reduced to tears on a week. I don't think I've never been reduced to tears at a job, thankfully. And then they still, 80+% still have empathy for the people that they're kind of dealing with. It's just an absolutely incredible statistic, and it takes a very compassionate person to still have those kind of ideals, even after being, on a weekly basis, potentially, being berated and brought to tears. So, and that is something though that is I think it's overlooked all the time.
So was it 46% abused on a weekly basis at work, 43% having been brought to tears at work, 56 have been threatened. It's really, it's brutal. But I think it's not so much about their kind of, you need the headlines and their kind of headline facts, but there's a concept of moral distress and moral injury.
Yeah.
And so moral distress is when you feel kind of uneasy, morally, like psychologically uneasy because of what's going on.
Yeah. And
so it might be as a result of like lack of power or agency, or there might be kind of people talk about structural limitations. So it might be that actually and this is an example that often happens to me. You're seeing patients who are waiting for emergency surgery, and the first thing you do is you apologise to them because they've been sat in a chair for 12 hours overnight and they're frail and they're old, but there's no beds. Or they've spent 24 hours, let's say, in an ambulance because the flow through the hospital is so challenging. And when you start your kind of interaction with the patient with an apology, it's horrible. And then the next kind of layer of that is called moral injury, and that's actually, there's evidence of kind of proper psychological harm associated with that. And you can get kind of moral disorientation, and you can feel like all kinds of problems of like disillusionment and stuff like that. I think it's really hard when the system is creaking, to have those as kind of as real sequelae of what can be going on. And I mean, there's so many tough things about working in health, and I don't want this to be a kind of like working in healthcare as a miserable pile-on, because it's not actually. I love my job. I'm incredibly lucky. I'm part of a brilliant team. I wholeheartedly believe that I add value, and I'm respected in society, and people say thank you to me, and like there is so many positives. But it's really hard. I was chatting to a friend of mine, and he's a GP, and he saw someone who was an incredibly complex patient, and he was one of several people who saw them in the last few months of their life. The patient passed away in the August. 10 months later, there were multiple complaints going on from the family, to and forth from the with the GP practice and with the kind of ICB. Then 2 months after that, he was asked to give a statement for the coroners, which it was a very unnerving thing to have to do. 4 months later, there was still no news. Then he was told he would have to be giving evidence in person in the coroners in 3 weeks' time. So then he had to get a legal team to support him. Then he was told that the hearing was going to be delayed. He heard that news less than 24 hours before the hearing, and it's been delayed for another five months. Now, this is someone who saw this patient, and don't get me wrong, there's an absolute tragedy in that this patient died, and quite reasonably the family want to kind of understand what's happened. But my friend's had over 18 months of uncertainty, and this thing hanging over him, essentially through no fault of his own. It's incredibly difficult, and you've got these various kind of threats and challenges to your practice and to your well-being all the time. And there are so many workforce challenges at the moment. There are people leaving the profession in droves. We haven't got enough people coming through. We're recruiting aggressively from abroad. So you've got kind of lots of international medical graduates, which is ethically has its own implications, but also isn't necessarily sustainable from our own kind of pool. There's a huge amount of burnout amongst kind of people throughout the profession. And one of the things which I kind of want to shine the light on is also the kind of tough stuff that you deal with. So you've got the kind of tough interactions, and when things don't go well. And but yeah, so there's a course called MedTrim, which is, I haven't actually done it, but I've been told it's brilliant. And it's all to do with kind of dealing with and coping with having seen things which are potentially traumatic situations. And so if you're talking about things which are life-threatening or life-changing, and I was reading some kind of blurb about that, and I was like, pretty much, in some specialties more than others, but pretty much all the time people are being exposed to things which are traumatic or potentially traumatic. And I there was a situation that I had so I talked about when I was a trainee, and at the time my wife was pregnant. We were renovating our house, so we had a kind of half-built house, and I was using all my spare time picking up extra shifts to try and pay for this. So my wife was steadily getting bigger. The builder was steadily getting more and more nervous, and I was doing a locum shift on the obstetric ward, and something pretty horrible happened. And I won't go into details, but as someone who was expecting or his wife was expecting their first child, I found it incredibly tough. Obstetrics is a very kind of emotionally charged place to work anyway. And I walked out of the room and just basically sobbed, just kind of sat in the corridor and sobbed. And there was kind of no one else was around, and I just had to kind of quietly just process what had just gone on. And then my bleep went off. I had to dry my eyes and go and see someone else who needed my help and stuff like that.
No time to almost process it, and that's what that is one thing I wanted to kind of touch on, because at the beginning I did say that, you know, in kind of health you will see things that most people won't see, right? I mean, I won't see a quarter of the things that probably you've seen while working in hospitals and whatnot. But how do you, so for instance yourself with those kind of situations, how people that are seeing these potentially traumatic situations, how do you actually begin to manage your own well-being after situations like this, but whilst keeping up with the demands? Literally exactly just what you said, right? Because you had you know, maybe a minute to cry and then your beep went off. How do you manage to deal with it? Because obviously a minute wouldn't be enough time to kind of process what's kind of happened. So would it be outside of work, unfortunately, in your own time? Because when you're at work, you're probably too busy to kind of actually, you know, if you're constantly going from kind of job to job, you probably don't have too much time to sit and think about it.
Yeah, I think I think everyone's different. Everyone processes it differently.
Yeah, definitely.
I've had a handful of things in my career that have kind of hit home more than it should have, or kind of surprised me. So like another situation which stays with me is like organ donation. I cannot emphasize enough what a truly amazing gift donating your organs is. Like,
yeah,
like it is amazing and it is life-changing, and I would encourage everyone who listens to make sure that they're on the organ donation register. The actual process of a patient on intensive care with their family, and their family saying goodbye to their loved one, and you as that kind of doctor pushing them away from their family and taking them to the operating theatre for their organs to be retrieved is
it's a very
I cannot tell you, it is indescribably hard, and I kind of almost well up just talking about it. And I think some of the stuff you see, like, do you know what, it should be difficult. It should be emotive, and I think actually it's if you didn't find it hard, then something's a little bit wrong. A bit of you has died inside. And I think it's important to kind of have ways to kind of talk about it, ways to kind of process it, and everyone's different. So I remember a night shift I finished, and I'd run to work, and I finished the night shift, and it was horrendous. It was absolutely tragic from start to finish. And I finished, got changed into my running kit, and I was walking out, and I saw one of the other doctors I'd been working with that night, and I just kind of shook my head at her. I was like, "You all right?" And she said, "Not really." And she said, "Are you?" I was like, "Not really." And I said, "I don't even think I've got it in me to run home, and I only live like a couple of miles away."
Yeah.
And she was like, "Do you want a lift?" I was like, "Yeah." And so we just sat in the car and we just talked about just how rubbish it was. And I think sometimes those kind of opportunities arise in a kind of slight opportune fashion like that. So chat to people who understand it, chat to colleagues, sometimes just having a drink, having a cup of tea with someone who was either involved or someone who wasn't involved, but someone who understands. And it needs to be the right person. So I remember phoning my mum after I've had lots of horrible shifts. I've had lots of good shifts as well. But I remember phoning my mum after a horrible shift, and she said, "Oh well, I'm very proud of you. I'm sure you did a wonderful job." And I was like, actually, that's not what I needed.
It's not it's not what you want to hear. It's not what you need, is it? There.
So you need the right people around you who get it. And I think, like different people have different resources. I think
definitely
the kind of well-being is becoming much more of a pervasive topic, and I think that's great. And I think there's a lot of resources out there, and there's kind of for example, each kind of bit of the country is divided up into deaneries. Deaneries have got professional support units. The BMA, for example, provide support with stuff. There are lots of ways to kind of to get professional help. And I think professional help is absolutely one of the key things, one of the key tools that is out there, because sometimes you might be affected by something to the point where actually just having a cup of tea or having a beer with a mate isn't sufficient. And I think sometimes you might have to have time away. You might have to step back from where you're working or what you're doing, and having colleagues who are understanding of that, and having kind of leaders and leaders both clinically but also within management who recognise that, and having empathy for each other is vital. And I feel very lucky in that I've never felt like I've been pushed into doing something. I know, unfortunately, I do know that like some people have had that happen to them.
Yeah.
But I think on the whole, actually, people are, when you say actually, there's a problem, I just need to step back. I think most people are supportive. But it's not always the case, and that's one of the real tragedies of healthcare, is that there is this slightly old-fashioned mentality of you just got to kind of tough it out, and it will be there.
Yeah, it's like the old saying, men don't cry and things like that. When it's like, the things like grandparents, my grandparents and things, maybe not so much, but my great grandparents, she definitely did say things like that, because that was the generation they were raised in, right? Whereas as we've, over the last 10, 20 years or so, certainly over the last 10 years, but the mental health side of it in general has become a lot more to the forefront. People are starting to really, I think, talk about it. But do you think, I know he said if sometimes you may need to step away, which is kind of difficult at the moment. And as you said, the burnout rate and the turnover, like people are leaving in droves, there aren't enough people coming in. It's kind of a pessimistic question, but do you think it's going to get worse before it gets better, in the grand scheme of things? Because I don't think anybody really has an answer as to how to fix the kind of the staffing issue. I mean, obviously get more people in, right? But how we do that is a big question mark, because as you said, from a sustainability point of view as well, if people are coming from abroad, they still need all the training, everything still needs to be done, and it takes lots and lots of time. But how do you think future generations of people that work in the NHS are going to kind of deal with being in the NHS?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think part of it is about retention.
Yeah.
So if you say to someone, well, rather than burning out in 6 months, why don't we just reduce your hours and make it a little bit easier? And one of the really great things that has happened across postgraduate training is in healthcare is that, and I think is in every specialty now, is that all trainees can go less than full time without needing a reason. So it used to be that you had to have you needed to be a carer, or you need to have childcare responsibilities, or something very specific. But actually, that's not the case. So if you want to be less than full time, you can be, and people are taking it up in droves. Now interestingly, that's got its own kind of consequence, because it means that actually some of the rotas are slightly short, and there's a kind of knock-on effect. But if fewer people are needing to leave completely or step away completely, then retention is absolutely massive. And I think one of the things that I think is fantastic is how a lot of people coming through are being really kind of taking ownership of their well-being, and I absolutely love it when I hear people say, like, actually, no, like that's not a day that I work, and I can't, I'm not prepared to kind of do stuff and like come in on my day off.
Yeah.
Because the kind of the old way of doing it, when I came through training, it was just like you just sucked it up. You just did it, right? You need to be. It was almost like a survival of the fittest, and like you sucked it up because you knew that in 7 years' time I'm gonna have a job, and it'll be a little bit easier. I'll have some breathing space. Whereas now people are saying, that's not okay. That's not actually acceptable.
Yeah.
And some more senior people in the profession will like raise their eyebrows and tut and say, they're not as tough as they used to be. But actually, I think it's brilliant, because I think it's people really taking ownership of their kind of well-being and making sure that what they do is sustainable. And there's all kinds of reasons why that's come about, but I think it's but I think it's that's a really, really positive thing.
Yeah, it's super important, I think, to prioritize your well-being, because if you're not prioritizing your well-being as well, it has a knock-on effect with your work life too, right? Like if you can't give your best self, that's going to show in when you're at work, especially when you're in healthcare. If you're not 100%, you can't give 100% to somebody else and the people that need it in the hospital. So I think prioritizing your well-being and retention is definitely super vital, because you spend all of these, as you said, 7 years, and you spend all of this time to get to a position where you are, and then people, they burn out and they leave, and it's such a shame, because you have to be extremely dedicated to get to to do all of the training and to do all of these things, and it's such a shame when the burnout and things causes people to leave, and because they clearly really want to be in the NHS, in healthcare. Otherwise, nobody would do all of that training, as you said. I can't remember I didn't add up all the years, but it was a lot of years that you did. So you clearly must be really passionate about it, and they're the people we want in the NHS, the people that are super passionate about, as you've said, compassionate, giving to people, caring people. Look, we want those people in the NHS, and that is how, as well, the patients get the best experience, getting 100%. Those kind of people working there.
I mean, there are two things you said there. One is when you're not in your game, and I think that's if there's really hard evidence, like really good science, that shows that if you've suffered from a moral injury, that stuff I was talking about earlier, your brain works differently. The pathways in your brain don't work as well. Your cells age faster. Your immune system, you actually become immunocompromised if you've suffered a moral injury, and your response to things like vaccines is worse. So there's this kind of, there's so much damage, not just to that person, but also if your brain isn't working properly, if you're slightly distracted, if like 3% of your bandwidth is taken up with worrying about the fact that you haven't got a parking space that morning, and you don't have a permit, and you might get a ticket, then actually you're going to be off your game for your patients. So that's so vital. And the other thing that I was going to say is that I'm such a strong believer in people not walking away, because I think there's been so much investment and effort and things that have gone along the way, and I get contacted by people like all the time on LinkedIn and asking for advice. How did I get into this, and what did I start doing, and kind of what route did I take? And most people are saying it because I want to leave medicine, because I've had enough. And I feel so lucky that I wouldn't necessarily say I've got the balance right, but I've got a degree of balance, that I get to do some clinical stuff and I get to do some non-clinical stuff. Because I think there are so many people who are great at what they do, but the way they're doing it isn't necessarily great. And I think, as kind of healthcare is undergoing this huge transformation at the moment, and it's been ongoing for ages, but, things like digital pathways and PIFU and all these kind of things, which are just kind of changing the way in which we do things, and working smart, not hard. I think people need to do that with themselves as well. And for every person who comes and says like, I just want to quit, I'm just like begging them not to quit. Just try and find something that you can do alongside your clinical role, because I think that is a much more sustainable way to do it.
Yeah, I think, and as you said, you mentioned it with the well-being thing. Everybody's different, right? Everybody will have things that work and that don't work, and everybody's balance will look different. But it is, I agree. I think if you've dedicated time and effort, clearly for the right reasons, right? You clearly want to be in this world. You just have to find a way to manage it, whatever that looks like. Everybody is completely different, but I think that is the key, and it will be really. This has probably been my favorite episode, because it's something that just does not get talked about. It's always kind of looking out towards the patients and things, and I think it's really interesting to kind of look in a little bit, because not everybody knows what you guys go through, and what the people working in the NHS go through, and what they see, and they don't understand, as you said, the trauma, everything around it is completely alien to somebody like me, because I've not been in that environment, right? And I think a lot of people are the same. So I think it's a really powerful topic to talk about, and we'll continue talking outside of this podcast about it anyway, and all sorts of topics. But hopefully people that have been listening will start to pay attention to it a little bit, and just, you know, when they go, if they're on a long waiting list, yes, it's frustrating, but the GP that you see, it's not their fault that you're on a long waiting list. Unfortunately, it's just it's just a product of what the NHS is at the moment, and you know, we all want it to be better, and everybody's kind of aiming to get to that stage, but it takes time, right? The NHS is a living, breathing thing, and it's a very big living, breathing thing. We can't just, it's not going to be overnight, you know, fixed. But no, I really appreciate your time today, Lawrie. It's been a really, really fantastic and insightful episode.
Well, thanks for having me. And I think I want my parting shots to be probably threefold, right? First of all, it's an amazing job. Okay, yep. And it's a real privilege, and I don't want anyone thinking that it's not. It really is. Second of all, if you're working in kind of the health tech sector and you're dealing with clinicians and people who are patient facing, and if they seem stressed or busy or distracted, probably just cut them some slack. I think it's really important. Just realize kind of what it's like. It is quite hard. And this isn't a poor me. Just bear in mind of the tough stuff.
Yeah.
And then I think finally, if anyone who's patient facing is listening to this and they're thinking of quitting or walking away, or they're close to burning out, try not to walk away. Try and find something that you can do alongside, because I think your skills are really valuable, and the NHS needs people who have got the insight to recognise that they're burnt out and to find a balance. And yeah, there's some brilliant opportunities out there. But if you are close to burning out or having a tough time, there are always people out there who are prepared to listen. And definitely speak up and speak out. Don't suffer in silence, because it's that's the worst thing you can do.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Health Tech Hub. We really hope you enjoyed, and thank you again for Lawrie for being the guest on this month's episode. I'll leave the link to Laurie's LinkedIn in the comments below, as well as to DrDoctor. The MyCare YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter and website link will also be in the description below. If you have any suggestions for topics that you'd like to see on this podcast, please do let me know either in the comments or message me directly on LinkedIn. I'll be happy to have a conversation and see if we can get it done. Thank you again, and I will see you next month.